To preface this, I love to drive. I'll sometimes take hours-long drives with no destination in mind. Just me, my music, and the road ahead of me. Living in Nebraska, I'd often take back roads or lonely highways, cutting through the countryside to small towns and eventually cities. I'd usually take these drives at night, since there was less traffic to worry about. I've done it since I had my license 4 years ago, and I've never once had any sort of issue, nor have I ever run into any trouble. That was, until a few nights ago. For reference, I'm a relatively small 22-year-old female, and as I've stated before, I'd often take these drives completely and utterly alone. They're a good way to clear my head when I'm stressed, upset, or overwhelmed, and help me to get a plan together to sort my personal issues out. I've also done these long and lonely drives to get away from the toxicity of my household when I used to live with my parents, as a means of coping with their alcoholism. Now that I've moved out, I'm in a much better place mentally, and I don't really have the urge to get in my car and just drive anymore. However, on the night this event took place, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed and stressed with a bunch of personal issues I'd rather not get into. I felt restless and irritable around my boyfriend, couldn't focus on anything else, and decided I would take a drive to clear my head. My boyfriend was understanding, and told me to be careful and to not be gone for too long, since it was getting pretty late. I agreed, gave him a kiss goodbye, and left. I drove around our city for about 30 minutes, but I was still feeling on edge about everything transpiring in my personal life, so I decided to drive further north down those familiar, dark, winding one-lane highways. I kept the car at a steady 65 miles per hour, taking the turns at a slower pace in case a deer jumped out around the bend. I was just admiring the vast, empty darkness of the snow-capped fields and barren trees. It was honestly a little bit creepy being all alone with no cars in sight and seemingly the middle of nowhere. The few houses miles back from the road were lightless, and the dead cornfields withered away and were covered in snow. It was like something out of a horror movie, and I half expected to see a ghost pop up in my rearview mirror, or see someone clamber out from the patches of trees dotting the horizon. The only light came from my headlights, and even then, I strained to see through the inky darkness of the night. By now, it was just after 11, and I told myself that once I made the familiar roundabout that would either take you to a small town or back up towards the city, I would head back to the city and just go home. The roundabout was still maybe 15 to 20 minutes away, but other than my imagination picturing the worst, I wasn't really all that concerned. I mean, I was by myself. I didn't have any other motorists to worry about. As I was rounding another bend, I noticed a vehicle with its hazards flashing, maybe a quarter of a mile away from me. It was some sort of sedan. It was dark colored and was angled to where only part of it was on the shoulder, while the rest was jutted out onto the road, like they had to pull over in a hurry, but didn't quite manage to do that. The driver's side door was flung wide open, and as I slowed my vehicle down and angled it towards the opposite side of the road to pass, I could make out what looked like blood on the inside of the open door. I didn't see anyone on the road or in the car, and I was the only motorist in sight. Cell phone reception is spotty at best in this part of the area, but more often than not, you couldn't get reception no matter how hard you prayed, which was definitely the case when I took a glance at my phone to see I had no service. So, a lone female on the road, at night, pulling up near a vacant vehicle that looks like someone had been attacked on the inside, with no cell service, was frightening at the least. Now, I'm no dummy. I've watched countless episodes of Investigation Discovery and Criminal Minds, and read far too many true crime books to know that this had the words bad and danger written all over it. But there was still a small part of me that worried something terrible had happened to whoever was in the vehicle, and I thought I needed to help. These roads don't get a lot of traffic late at night, and temperatures were well below freezing. If someone were hurt or in trouble, there was no one and nothing else to help them out but me. Still, I erred on the side of caution. I was still driving my car, though a bit more slowly. As I approached the vehicle, I rolled down my passenger window a bit, shut off the music, and called out, "Hey, anyone there?" I didn't hear a response. I worried they were passed out somewhere, but I wasn't about to get out and look for them. I told myself I'd call out one last time, and if I didn't hear anything, I would leave, and the moment there was reception, I'd call it in. If I did hear someone, well, I'd figure out my next course of action then. So, again, I shouted, "Hey, what happened? Are you okay?" There was silence for a few seconds, and then I heard rustling in the shadows of the trees, followed by a gruff voice saying, "Yeah." I was relieved at first, and was about to say something in response, or possibly even stop my car to get out, when I noticed three things nearly simultaneously. As I inched my way past the front of the sedan, I noticed there was no damage to the hood or anywhere else on the vehicle, which I found to be strange, considering the blood on the inside of the door. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glance of someone coming out from behind the sedan, and they were making their way towards my car, fast. The person did not have any blood on them or appeared injured in any way. They were wearing a mask, not like a face mask for COVID or a ski mask or anything normal, but one of those masks you would see in the Purge movies, and they were holding something in their hand. I don't know what it was. I couldn't get a look, but from its length and shape, my guess was maybe a crowbar or something. I don't need to tell you that I slammed on the gas the moment I noticed those things, and drove like a bat straight out of hell. With my heart thundering in my chest and my entire body shaking, my window was still rolled down in my haste, and the music was still shut off, so I could very clearly hear someone, definitely a man, shouting at me, though I had no clue what they were saying. I just knew I had to get out of there immediately. I stole one last look in my rearview mirror as I drove away, mostly to see if they were getting in their sedan to follow me, or if they had stopped. The man with the weapon was still standing in the middle of the road watching me, and right before I looked away from the mirror, I saw a second man emerge from the trees that had been rustling around earlier, also wearing one of those creepy masks, and had no trace of blood on him. I probably broke every law for speeding that night, but I wanted to get as far away from those men as possible. As soon as I made it to the roundabout, I turned towards town and parked in the Walmart parking lot. Thankfully, there were still cars, who I assumed were workers closing up shop, and proceeded to have a full-on meltdown. When I could pull myself together, I called one of my friends who was a police officer to tell him what happened and ask what I should do. He was concerned for me, and after asking if I was okay, where I was, and if they followed me, he told me since it was out of city limits, he couldn't do much on his end, but he could get in contact with the local police in that jurisdiction to take my statement and check it out. I agreed, thanked him, and while I waited for police to show up, I called my boyfriend. Through my hysterical sobs and panic, I managed to tell him what had happened. He was, as you could imagine, super freaked out for my safety and wanted me to either come home immediately or drive down himself to take me home. I told him the police were on their way to take my statement, but I stayed on the phone with him until I saw the familiar police cruisers pulling into the lot. I gave the police my statement, and they assured me they would go back to the spot. I told them about the sedan, though with no cameras and no description of the men, I wasn't sure they'd be able to find them. I didn't even get the license plate number, though at the time of my panic, the thought never came to mind until the police were asking if I got it. All they had to go off of was a dark-colored sedan and two guys with masks. After I gave my statement, I went home and stayed curled up close to my boyfriend the whole night, listening to every sound the house made, in fear it would be those guys arriving any minute to finish whatever it was they started. Since the incident, I haven't heard back from the police about whether or not they have any leads, and I'm not sure they ever will. I'm just thankful I'm still here, and that I didn't stop my car or get out. I'm not sure what would have happened if I did. Needless to say, I won't be going on any more late-night drives to anywhere, and I hope I never cross paths with those freaks again. I hung out with my girlfriend for the day at her house. I ended up leaving work around 10 or 11 p.m., so it was quite dark out. Before I drove off, my girlfriend hung out with me in my car for a few minutes. For context, I drive a Dodge Challenger, but the electronic locking system was broken, so I would always have to manually lock it. When my girlfriend stepped out of my car, she did not lock the door. I drove off, and instead of taking the back road home like I usually did, I decided to take the main road. Since it was late, there weren't many cars out. However, there was a lady standing next to a bus stop. She was pacing around in a circle, and I got the sense that she was anxious or nervous about something. When she saw my car, she flagged me down. I pulled over and reached over to roll down the window. That's when I noticed the door wasn't locked, and before I could do anything, the lady opened up the passenger door and took a seat. I was surprised by this, but didn't feel like this lady was a threat. She had blonde hair and was probably in her late 30s or early 40s. I asked her if she was okay or if she needed help. She told me that she was just trying to get home, but her phone died, so she couldn't get a hold of anyone. She also said she missed the last bus. This sounded plausible to me. and since she didn't seem threatening and was already in my car, I offered to drive her home. I started driving up the main road and asked for directions to her place. We drove for maybe 2 minutes when she told me to turn into a residential neighborhood. As we were driving through it, she started talking to me nonstop. "Thank you so much for stopping. Not everyone is as nice as you. Your car is super awesome too." I replied with a weak, yeah, thanks. She went on, "It's so nice to find someone who is so trusting this late at night. I like trusting people." At that point, we came to a stop sign, so I looked left and right. When I turned to the right, she gave me a creepy smile, like an ear-to-ear Joker type smile. I also noticed for the first time that her pupils were very dilated, and they were darting around all over the place. At this point, I finally started to realize that picking up a strange woman at night, who may be on drugs, perhaps was not the best idea. I started to think of ways to get her out of the car, but I also didn't want to be rude. Before I could think of anything though, she asked me for my phone so she could give her friend a call and let them know she was coming home. I sheepishly lied to her and said I didn't have a phone. I was then struck with a feeling of dread because my phone's ringer was set to loud, and any notification or message would reveal my lie. A moment later, with my luck, someone texted me and my phone went off. "I thought you didn't have a phone." "Oh, I forgot I had it. I thought I left it at home." "I don't appreciate being lied to." She trailed off as if she had more to say. I started to get really nervous at this point. We were deep in this neighborhood and it was really dark. I needed to get this lady out now. She then pointed up the road and told me to take a right at the next stop sign. The road curved a bit, so from where I was, I could see that there was a dead-end sign. For whatever reason, the thought of turning onto this dead-end street terrified me. I then had an idea. Right before we got to the stop sign, I pulled over and told the lady that my car was making a funny noise, and the temperature gauge was slowly going up. I turned off my car and popped my trunk. I told her I was grabbing a flashlight from the trunk, and asked if she could step out and hold the light for me while I looked at the engine. I got out of the car. I looked back at her, and she looked both mad and annoyed, but she stepped out. I went to my trunk and rummaged through the things I had there for a few seconds. My flashlight was right in front of me, but I needed to be sure she was standing in front of the car. Once she was there, I closed my trunk and started walking to the front of the car with my flashlight. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had to keep my voice steady. I gave her the flashlight and then said something like, "Oops, I forgot to pop open the hood. Let me do that real quick." I got back in my car and I popped my hood. At the same time though, I turned the car back on and threw it into reverse. The lady just stood there, staring at me. Once I had enough distance, I put the car back in drive and drove straight past her. She was standing near a streetlight, so I got one last good look at her. I shuddered as I noticed she was holding a knife in her hand. There was also a large man that stepped out of the shadows and stood next to her. At first, I thought she might be getting attacked, but then they walked away together. I know that this was 100% my fault. It was stupid of me to let her get in my car, and even worse of me for agreeing to drive her home. I don't know why she didn't try to attack me earlier, or if she had an even worse plan. I'm glad to say I'll never have to find out. This happened 2 years ago when I was a freshman in college and had just started dating my boyfriend. He lived a few towns away from me at the time, and I was taking some of the back roads towards the parkway to get home. I had fallen asleep at his house while watching a movie, so it was about 3 a.m. and I was exhausted. I knew the way to the parkway well enough, but I was still not that familiar with that particular part of town. As you get closer to the parkway, you have to actually cut through a park to get to the entrance ramp. That being said, there were very few lights, and the nearest house wasn't far, but it was totally out of sight. I pulled onto the short road and saw a golden sedan stopped in the middle of the road. It was actually stopped in a way that it didn't matter which way you were traveling, it was going to be a squeeze to get around them. Just for a little background, I'm very small, and at the time, I might have weighed 100 pounds, and I only stand at 5 feet tall. I slowed my car down, and I tried to see if I could see headlights coming from the other direction so I could pull around. But before I could even move, a tall man ran around from the front of this stopped car and started waving his arms at me to get my attention. As I mentioned, I'm small, young, alone, and it's 3 a.m. There was no way I was going to stop for this guy. He didn't look worried. He didn't even look that scary, but an alarm went off in my head that something wasn't right. I tried to inch up so that I could pass him, but he stood right in front of my car and was not going to let me pass. I quickly locked my car doors and stopped. He started trying to talk to me and was now making his way over to my window. My hearing isn't very good, but he was so close to me that I could read his lips. He was asking me for help and wanted my cell phone to call someone. I said, "No, sorry." He had his hand on my window and looked at me, saying, "Please." I said no again and didn't care if I ran his foot over at this point. I was starting to get scared. I was able to just barely pass, but had to do so in the oncoming traffic lane. I looked in my mirror and saw he was just standing in the middle of the road, staring at me. I could see the anger on his face in my brake lights. I pulled back into the right lane, and as I did, my headlights caught 3 men climbing out of the bushes. They were all dressed in the same black t-shirt and jeans, and they were all glaring at me. I could almost feel the anger radiating off of them. I gunned it and flew up the road onto the parkway. I could feel my whole body shaking. My mind was racing. What just happened? I pulled out my phone and called the police. They had to transfer me a few times because no one could figure out if I should be talking to the county police or highway patrol. It was basically at the parkway entrance and no one wanted to deal with me. When I was finally able to tell someone what had happened, they sent a car over to check it out. I had asked the officer to call me back and let me know if they found them, since I drove over there a lot. He later told me that by the time they got there, the men, along with the car, were gone. But not even 5 minutes after they spoke to me, another woman called in who had the same story as me in that same location. I was advised not to drive over by the park at night anymore. I had no idea that it was not safe at the time, and have never taken that exit at night since.